Thank you so much to all of you for joining us, and hello to all of our participants. Let me begin by presenting this book a little bit before letting the co-editors brag about it. This is a text where Simon and Richard reached out to their prodigious networks and pulled in really some of the leading thinkers across the broad, I would say almost the full spectrum of trade policy. And they did it with a very pragmatic agenda, so much so they put it in the subtitle. They asked them to contribute ideas that aren't pie in the sky, that aren't, oh, what if we lived in a better world? But we're focused around what might members actually be willing to do that might actually make a difference and might begin to not only move the trade policy forward, but revitalize the faith, confidence, and input of government, civil society, and others into multilateralism around trade policy. For fairly obvious reasons, there couldn't be a more important or exciting time to talk about all this. So with my little spiel out of the way, I'm hoping all of you didn't just alt-tab to start reading, because we do have an hour of good content for you. You can do it immediately thereafter. As I said, the book is free and linked from the event. With that, let me introduce our first co-editor, Richard. Richard, let me ask you perhaps a slightly redundant sounding question, but 6 years ago, everybody was talking about plurilaterals. TPP, TISA, TTIP, plurilaterals were the game, multilateralism was perhaps old news. Then 3 years ago, we all started talking about bilaterals. It was all about country to country. Why is revitalizing multilaterals important?
Well, thanks for the question. First of all, let me just give a shout out to all the authors of the 21 chapters and did an incredible job. And we can't list all their names because there's so many, but they've written a smashing good book that Simon put together and I helped a little. But let me come to your question on multilateralism. The world has experienced one of the greatest multilateral events of the last century. There's been a commonality of the human experience over the last 9 months that hasn't happened in a very, very long time. And in particular, there are two pressing challenges facing the entire world. The first one is to get a few billion doses of vaccines distributed on the world so we can put this pandemic to bed so we can get on with our economic life. And I would like to rush to say that, as is true for so much of multilateral, for instance, climate, we can't get rid of this disease anywhere until we get rid of it everywhere. That's the first one. The second one is the world is in one of the most synchronized, deepest recessions we've had in 3/4 of a century. Trade will be a very important part of coming out of that recession. But as part of the fight against the recession and COVID, quite a large number of measures have been put in that could potentially switch from being viewed as protecting jobs to being protectionism. And that inevitable conflict that will arise as we move out is best settled in a multilateral setting because it's engaging such a wide range of people. This is no longer just the G7 or just the G20 or even some of the other groups. It really is the whole world. Now, I could go on. In the medium run, we need the multilateralism for climate change. We need to find a modus vivendi between the Chinese system of capitalism and the American system of capitalism. But I'll just stop right there and pass it back to you.
You may regret doing that, Richard, because it's my job here to challenge my boss. Okay, so you've talked about a few billion doses of vaccine needed. We've got a deep recession. The crisis is, I think, obvious, and the scale of the challenge is obvious. But the book premises almost, it's in all 21 chapters, and really the kind of underlying thesis of the book is that in every crisis is an opportunity. And so far, what you've described is the scale of the challenge. But perhaps if I'm sitting in a capital and I'm looking at what's the measures that I've rolled out, as you said, the measures to protect jobs, maybe my reaction is not we need to stop these before they become protectionist, but this crisis proves that I need the policy flexibility to enact measures like this, and that I shouldn't be constrained by a multilateral process, and that the bidding war, for example, over vaccines proves that actually, individual state power is the way to go. So where do you see the opportunity in this crisis, and why do you think multilateralism has a chance here?
Well, I would just fall back on the old usual logic of multilateral trade cooperation. That is, if everybody tries to protect, we end up in a situation where there's lots of walls in our factories, lots of rocks in our harbors, and nobody's better off. Now, of course, it would be great if any one country could get away with some sort of unfair practice to bring back this, that, or the other. But once we realize that everybody's doing it, and also to realize that actually there's only a handful or two handfuls of countries who would actually win in that competition, and it would be devastating for the rest of the developing, mostly the developing world and Africa and poor people. Once we realize that the cooperation is not just good for the rich countries, because when we all liberalize, everybody's better off, but it also avoids a human tragedy in the developing world. So it's really nothing new. That's just the win-win of multilateral cooperation.
Let's hope that message resonates, because you said it's an important one. We might go to your fellow co-author, Simon Evenett now. Simon, I think sort of famously, you wear a second hat over at Global Trade Alert, where you have done more work than possibly anyone on earth on measuring all of these government measures, even well before COVID, of basically the way governments have been using the levers at their disposal for what we would consider positive and negative ends. So I wonder if we could start off with you by just giving us a glimpse, as the book does, of where are we? Where were we before COVID in terms of government interventions into global markets? What are the kind of things governments have tried during COVID? And where does it look like they're headed in their interventions to drive us out of the crisis?
So let me organize my thoughts in the way that we do in the introduction. We see before the pandemic hit, three sets of forces bearing down on the trading system. There were the legacy of shocks, of which the most important was the global financial crisis. And to directly answer your question, the reaction of many governments to that crisis was actually not to resort to 1930s type tariff increases, but to use lots of subsidies to import competing firms, as well as export support. Now, as we point out in the introduction, the export support never went away. It never got unwound. But half of the trade affected by subsidies to import competing firms was unwound. The rest was not. So we had a legacy problem from a previous shock. And this actually leads us to a sort of I think a fundamental observation which is made in the book, and which many of the authors contribute to, and that is that the WTO needs to raise its game in terms of crisis management. We can't just, now that we've had the second systemic crisis in 15 years, we really need to be thinking about how this organization can stretch itself to be able to function, monitor, and better inform policymaking back in national capitals in a way that doesn't hurt trading partners as much. The second big factor bearing down on the system are a series of longer term shifts, which are eating away either at the relevance of the system or at people's support for it. So, of course, the development of digital trade and climate change as issues, these are things which are taking place outside of the current set of rules, and that's a shame. And the more that happens, the less relevant the WTO's current set of rules will seem to many policymakers. So I think that's a concern there. The other big shift, of course, is the rise of China, and with it, we now have different types of capitalism which are inside the WTO inside the WTO tent, and this is then raising the questions: how do we manage the tensions between them? And of which we've seen plenty in the last few years. And that sort of classic interface problem is something we highlight in the book, is something which needs to be addressed as well. And the third area, in terms of where were we at before the pandemic hit, we refer to shackles. This is the third of the three S's. And the shackles are the sort of modes of thought which were basically inherited from the Uruguay round, which seem to have trapped us into a view which says only binding accords matter, not other forms of of multilateral trade cooperation, and that dispute settlement in a highly legalistic, rigid form is the only way in which we can seriously settle disagreements. Now, I think we've seen both of those viewpoints being confronted with realities which have been which have pointed in other directions. And so we see the shackles of previous thinking as being a problem too. So that's where we were before the pandemic. The pandemic has hit. To answer very briefly what governments have been doing, in essentially two things. We've seen a lot of import reforms, especially as it relates to medical goods, medicines, and medical equipment. So that's the good side. The downside is we've seen also a huge expansion in the number of subsidies being offered to firms, and I don't just mean any old subsidies. If a firm is being told to shut down its activities and then given money by the government to pay its staff, I don't think that confers much of a commercial advantage on that firm. So I'm not worried about subsidies like that. I am worried about bailouts like the one we saw for Lufthansa, which was deliberately designed to make sure that Lufthansa was a global airline champion after the pandemic. And that observation was made by the CEO of Lufthansa to the Financial Times. It's not what Simon thinks, it's what he thinks. So we're seeing that's the bad side, that's the worrying side of the pandemic response that we're seeing. And of course, what we could be setting ourselves up for is another set of trade tensions a few years from now in sectors where there's lots of excess subsidization and excess capacity. And we've seen that movie and we know how it ends. It ends in lots and lots of disagreement between WTO members. So we have to do better than that.
Interesting. So there's a lot of scope for some of these measures to kind of go off the rails. Mm-hmm. One thing that surprised me, I have to say, when I read your chapter in the book, Simon, which talks about export subsidization specifically, and calls for a work program on it, was that as one of the negotiators at MC10, it was like seeing an old enemy that you thought dead and buried turn up at your Starbucks. For negotiators, we mostly treat export subsidies as a done deal. We fixed that. It's illegal. It's not done. But even sort of a casual glance at your research says that that's perhaps preemptive triumphalism. So I wonder if you could talk us through, well, firstly, what is export subsidization? Why is it an issue? And secondly, what's the work program you envisage you would recommend on it to kind of address it?
Okay, so the contemporary export support, I prefer to call it export support, typically takes three forms. The first is offering incentives to exporters through national tax systems. And that can be done in a number of ways, some of which are more blatantly WTO inconsistent than others. The second area is to support the export of goods and services by essentially subsidizing the transportation infrastructure solely for exports, not for any other purpose, right? The third area is to look at all of the creative work that many export credit agencies are engaged in. When we first grew up, we were told that export credit agencies were to help mom and pop manufacturers win their first contract abroad. That is not the world of export finance. Export finance is about issuing huge dollops of subsidies to large multinational companies as they compete for customers. And that's the actual practice that has evolved over time. Now, when you put all that together this year, we found evidence that 47 different countries have announced that they have put in place export support schemes, and that these export support schemes implicate the trade and exports of over 160 different nations. And we found that when we dug into the fine-grained trade data, there were 48 nations who have seen 1 billion or more of their exports competing in foreign markets against subsidized rivals. And there's 11 countries for which the export exposure is over $10 billion. And this is all represented in charts and maps in the paper, in my chapter. And so what this suggests is precisely what you've said, Dmitry, earlier. We thought we'd tamed this problem of export support. But in fact, it's a bit like the American game of whack-a-mole, right? Which is you hit export support on one dimension and it pops up somewhere else. And the concern, of course, is that the system is regressing as a result here. And so the thing to do, of course, at this stage first is, because this is still a relatively new area and there's lots of ongoing developments, is to scope out the problem. And so that people can begin to understand the scale of it. They can begin to see why export supports are a problem which has to be solved multilaterally. It's very hard to deal with them in regional trading agreements. And so much of the logic, which I suspect was developed in the case of agricultural export support, will be sort of reinvented and reused, or could be used here to develop a logic for further action. And ultimately, what I propose in the chapter is a step-by-step approach to going through, what are the types of export supports, where is the export support problematic, where does it duplicate what the private sector does normally, and then how do you begin to tame it?
It's fascinating how much the kind of dichotomy between popular understanding of the programs and where the money's really going in this area mirrors what's going on in other areas. Whether it's the fishery subsidies debate, where so much of the conversation focuses on small scale fishermen, when in fact the bulk of the money might be going to these gigantic multinational fishing fleets, or in agriculture, where the traditional image of the small farmer subsidy recipient doesn't necessarily match up with where some member states' currency is going. So I think that really does highlight what your chapter talks about, which is the need to begin at what should be an uncontroversial step, and that's, let's figure out what's going on. Let's systematize figuring out where the problems are, where the money's going, and what are the programs, and what are they trying to achieve, and are they distorting trade? I realize this is a big ask, but Richard did dob you in as having done all of the work, so you're probably better suited to be teed up with this. I wonder if you could name check a few of the other ideas that the other, I guess, 19 chapter authors laid down. What are the few that struck you as particularly interesting or unexpected, or just a really good next step?
So in answering that, let me build a bridge to what you were saying earlier, which is that one of the messages that comes through in many chapters is the need for the WTO to dramatically enhance its capabilities in the area of transparency. And so a number of the chapters in TBT, SPS, state-owned enterprises, and other areas talk about how to improve the transparency of the WTO's, or basically of the policies of the WTO members, so of the governments that are the issue. Now that then is linked to an even bigger theme, which is in the book, and we have a whole section of papers in the book on how we can strengthen the WTO as a crisis management organization. And I think this is one of the most important things I think people need to think about, given that we now have had the second systemic crisis in 15 years. We better get used to the idea that the WTO is going to have to manage crises. And we can't just put our hands up in the air, as often is done, and say, look, countries have flexibilities, they can do what they like during crises, come back and tell me when it's over. Instead, I think we need to be thinking about how do we monitor what governments are doing, how do we help identify better practices which have less adverse consequences for their trading partners, and then how do we get this organization to deliberate better. And indeed, one of the chapters talks about how trade ministers could also play a much stronger role in helping the WTO through crisis times, as well as a number of steps which could be taken within their organization. Now, another chunk of a group of papers looks at the WTO inside the broader world trading system, because one of the big things we've learned in this pandemic is that the WTO could have all the best rules in the world, but if governments prevent shipping crews from leaving their ships and basically now enabling shipping crews to change, then we can have essentially shipping being substantially frozen or diminished in the quantity of goods which can be taken from country to country. And this then suggests that the health of the trading system depends on a set of policies which are done by governments and which fall under the auspices of another organization. The same is true of air transport. The same is true of vaccine development. These are all really critical issues for where international trade is implicated, but they lie outside of the remit of the WTO, and where the WTO needs to engage with other organizations in ways, I think, earlier, and perhaps in ways which are perhaps more long-term and more compelling. So a second set of chapters in the book really go through these areas, these sort of interface areas between the WTO and other organizations. And then the third set of ideas in the book are how to upgrade or revamp or rethink the WTO rulebook in light of developments which have happened now and previously. So there's a really nice chapter on trade in medical goods and where, ideas for a non-binding moratorium to be able to lock in all those import reforms I talked about earlier, and to try and discourage governments from using export curbs could be part of that as well. So the book has three sets of three buckets of recommendations, and each of them I think are worth studying in turn.
And on that vein, thank you so much, Simon. On that vein of studying the recommendations of the book, we turn to the WTO Deputy Director General, Alan Wolff. I think in a lot of ways, the WTO has become a totemic, almost avatar of this debate over multilateralism. The very public travails of the organization in recent years have made it the locus of this discussion. And you keep hearing over and over again that the organization really needs to kick some goals, to demonstrate again why so many organizations, so many members have devoted so much time and energy to it. Now you've heard Simon elucidate a number of ideas here today. I'm sure you're very used to as at the WTO Secretariat of having others telling you what you should be doing. But did any of them jump out at you as pragmatic, good next steps that might be possible within the complex political world the WTO finds itself in?
Well, I thank you. First of all, I'd say it's a very valuable book. And I think the new Director General will welcome it. The introduction, if she doesn't get beyond the introduction, she will have gotten a good start, and others can fill her in on the various chapters. Corrective action is long overdue at the WTO. I tend to be, in my heart, I'm beyond pragmatism. In my head, I'm somewhat, sometimes before pragmatism kicks in. Because we're not moving, and we have to move. We expect to hear from the European Union in December, ideas on putting stuff on the table, proposals with respect to COVID-19. We don't really have much of that to date. There's discussion inside groups, but not in the WTO itself. So it seems to me, basically, there are three areas that are the spheres for operation. Rulemaking, we got to, and I take the point that some of the rulemaking would be best practices. That's what's happened in the technical barriers to trade area, where best practices are adopted and the members live by them, and you don't have to have something that is always subject to litigation. A second area, of course, speaking of litigation, is dispute settlement has to get put back into place and isn't going to happen first off, but should. And a lot of what's discussed in this book is about governance. By governance, it seems to me there are three functions. There is the legislative function, there is the quasi-judicial function, but there's also the executive functions. Where do we have our executive functions? We have temporary committee chairs, very good people, very often, who are trying to move things forward. We don't have an executive as such. There is very little independence on the part of the Secretariat. So as Simon says, we should be doing a better job of monitoring, and that can happen with resources and members' acquiescence, and we should get there. What stood out to me is there are 10 areas, but I certainly won't hit all of them, but 10 areas that stand out as some things we have to do. The crisis management is number one, and that's what the book is very heavily about. Making sure that trade fosters and doesn't impede medical supplies and upcoming vaccines. Supporting the economic recovery. There are things we could do with respect to the economic recovery. The WTO has convening power. We got together the major banks and the IMF and the World Bank and the regional development banks and said, try to restore trade finance. We did this in 2008, 2009. It's even more necessary now because there was no complete recovery. So that's essential. The interest of the members, the crisis is not just, of course, COVID-19, but climate change, for example. There are a lot of ideas on the part of members that have not really gotten enough traction on plastic pollution in the ocean, on areas such as circular economy. We're going to have to get into those areas, and they're going to be presented with them. Kristalina Georgieva at the International Monetary Fund has been talking about a carbon tax. A border tax adjustment is going to be directly in the WTO's necessary agenda going forward. What do we do with it? Hasn't been faced yet. What we need is a beginning of deliberations. We have been missing deliberations other than on specific topics, digital economy and the e-commerce talks, how to help MSMEs, the micro and medium small enterprises, fishery subsidies. We're not talking about the broad range of things that make us relevant. We have to become relevant. So, and there are some tough things that I would welcome, not that we haven't discussed tough things now, like food security, which requires, in my view, an emphasis on open borders and supply commitments. We haven't dealt with food security adequately. Fortunately, during this pandemic, we've been in much better shape in terms of world cereal supplies than we were in the financial crisis. So we have to, I think, broaden the discussion. It doesn't mean everything has to move forward at the same speed. I found the specific chapters very interesting on specific ideas. I think that we have to become more sensitive, given the rise of populism around the world, to the fact that the WTO is about fairness. It's about, if you make something that's good in a factory, you can export it. You can sell it around the world. If you have an idea, your intellectual property will be protected. If you have, if you're effective as a farmer, if you're efficient, you'll be able to sell your goods around the world, not saddled with non-science-based regulations and the like. So the one thing that might have been emphasized a little bit more strongly, I think, is the leaders have talked about WTO reform, but they have not sold the multilateral trading system to their peoples. They meet in about 10 days, and I would hope that they would come away, other than just having a pledge to multilateralism again, talk about the need to address the things that are in this book, crisis management, and get serious about actually moving the debate forward. So I'll stop there for a moment and look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Alan. The perennial, I've now realized I'm muted. It wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without it. Thank you very much. There's really a lot to dig into there, and we could talk for hours. I especially will want to come back to you on some of these governance and communications questions, because I think the challenges of new rulemaking at the WTO are very well publicized, but with a new DG coming in, we hope very soon, all eyes will be on how does she use the governance tools of her office and of the WTO Secretariat to advance some of these issues around crisis management, around helping members solve the multilateral system. So given that this book is supposed to be pragmatic ideas for her, I hope to come back to you on some of those, as well as to our other speakers. And by the way, to our participants, I do encourage you to drop your questions in chat. We will be moving to Q&A in a little while. And we've already had questions emailed into us before the session even started, which is, I think, a record for sessions. So please do get your questions in. Emily, I might turn to you. Something Alan just said, which is that, you know, if this concept of if you make something that's good, you can sell it around the world, was, I think, pretty severely tested during COVID-19, at least in the headlines, as countries realized that certain members were making things so well that others had become reliant on them as part of their supply chains, whether that is, and that actually goes beyond COVID. You know, the Chinese are coming to this realization with Silicon Valley chips for their IT sector, and the other countries are realizing their dependence on China for PPE may have been beyond their comfort zone. Now, you literally wrote the book on this with Rob Johnson and Chad Baldwin, called Global Supply Chains and Trade Policy. What are you seeing out there in the debate between repatriation, diversification, kind of specific diversification from one place, and how is that going to color all of these, you know, optimistic or at least not as jaded as usual conversations we've been having here tonight?
That's a great question, and it's a doozy, right? I would have to have my head deep in the sand to ignore all the rising calls for nationalization and repatriation of supply chains during COVID, but also before COVID. I mean, this was the role of global value chains, and particularly global sourcing and import dependence, was front and center in the US-China trade war conversation that we've been having since 2018. And so there are a bunch of different pieces to unpack here. I think maybe the first thing to do, though, is to dispel a false narrative that's been in a lot of those newspaper headlines, which is that the trade disruptions and the shortages of crucial materials were fundamentally about GVCs, global value chains or global supply chains, this idea of global production fragmentation, and also import dependence. So first and foremost, most of these high-profile shortages were driven by a fundamental mismatch between demand and supply. We had demand. This is Sébastien Mirabeau wrote a beautiful chapter in this book. I think it's chapter 18 if you're reading along at home. Please read that. He makes this case in a very compelling way with lots of great data. But look, if you have an overnight increase in demand for PPE, personal protective equipment, that's 50-fold, it doesn't matter where in the world you're producing the stuff, you're not gonna have enough. And so the problem wasn't that China was producing the face masks. The problem was in the entire world, anywhere in the world, there were not enough face masks to go around. And so first, I think we've got to dispel some of these narratives about the risks involved in sourcing with what we saw, which was mismatch between demand and supply. And so I think the WTO can and already has played an important role in that. And I think economists need to be crystal clear in separating that out. So the issue with COVID and global value chains or global production fragmentation is what I like to call the ventilator parts problem, right? There's this concern that you might have a country, and there was an instance I saw in the Swiss newspapers last spring, where a country in Eastern Europe, I guess I don't want to name names here, but there was a country that imposed a sort of simplistic, gosh, you know, we're going to need ventilators, so let's like stop exporting everything that could be associated with ventilators and medical parts so that we have enough supplies domestically. Well, they were supplying parts for ventilators that were made in Switzerland. And it turns out that a part for a ventilator is no good unless it's put in the ventilator, right? And so the disruption in the value chain there could have been very severe, but it was also incredibly short-lived. The firms that were involved in this called up the governments and said, hey, wait a second, there's an unintended consequence. We can't have this ventilator parts problem. Let's make sure these parts get into the ventilators so the ventilators can be produced and shipped back to the countries that need them. So it's really important to recognize that global value chains knit together the interests of firms and consumers across borders and around the world. And you very generously cited my work with Rob Johnson and Chad Baldwin. You know, this is exactly what we found pre-pandemic, pre-US-China trade war, is that since the 1990s, as countries become more and more integrated in their global value chains, the sort of temptations of protectionism have been deteriorating as a result. I mean, it's really simple intuition, right? Beggar thy neighbor economic policies aren't going to serve you very well when you and your neighbors share the same lawn, when you have deeply integrated economic self-interests. And this is particularly important when we're thinking about how trade policy is made in practice. Firms are often demonized for bringing in corporate interests. And of course, there are times when firms do not play a helpful role in global trade policies. I, in much of my work, have written about my concerns in that regard. But firms also can make this very clear. Firms can say, whoa, 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 wait a second. When you recognize the reality of how we make things, doing the best thing that we're good at, as Alan said, focusing on our strengths and producing a great product in the world, we do this in partnership with suppliers and customers all around the world. We need a fair playing field. We need transparency in policy. And so I think one of the optimistic silver linings coming out of COVID for the global trading system is that we've seen remarkable resilience in the global value chains themselves. And it's because of this recognition, either of shared purpose, or maybe it's just mutually assured destruction. If we raise barriers, then everybody's production is going to go to pot. But I actually think we're doing better in that regard than the newspapers would have you think.
Thank you, Emily. And it's fascinating how much that resonates with what Alan was saying earlier, and what I think is the premise of this book, in part, or at least the sort of scene setting of this book, which is that if you take a half step back, the rules and the systems actually worked a lot better than in some ways we could have hoped. That in the face of an unprecedented recession and in the face of not unprecedented pandemic, but certainly a recently unprecedented pandemic, stories like the ventilator parts problem were probably the exception rather than the rule. Everyone freaked out, but not necessarily quite that hard. And I think the rules and this communications piece Alan talks about, the message did in some ways get through, if perhaps insufficiently. I'm going to turn to audience questions in just a minute because we have a good number of them and they're far more interesting than I am. But before I did just want to come back to Richard for a second. Because I was really kind of curious about what the test you and Simon used for pragmatism. I mean, you're in this kind of privileged position, I suppose, where you are close observers of the WTO and WTO membership, but one step removed from it. So what was your perception of what constitutes a pragmatic step that makes a difference?
Well, I think the first screen is we let the experts talk. So we had we asked the right people.
Is that a dig at me, Richard?
Yeah, well, yeah, we let's not go there quite yet, Dmitry. But if you want to write the next one, we'll work on that. So no, but we let the experts talk, I think, and we listened to them and what they thought was pragmatic. And of course, many of them are really area experts and they have an idea of what's reasonable. And we, by which I mean Simon, actually asked them to be very pragmatic and very direct on what they think they can make progress on, whatever it was. And so we got recommendations on crew clearing in Singapore, things like that. The second thing is I think we were screening it for things that could have high value in the short run and were politically possible. And as we've been saying several times, all of us, is basically the crisis has created a harmonic in the global economy that didn't exist there before, especially on medical supplies, whether every aspect of that, but also the shipping of it, the vaccines, the idea that, as Emily pointed out, trade has been a hero in this pandemic so far. If it were not for the import of personal protection equipment from East Asia into the United States and Europe, there would be doctors and nurses treating COVID patients without proper protection. So this is an opportunity to realize that we need the trading system in order to get where we need, because if everybody does what they do best and import the rest, and there's more for everything. And when you come to a resource constraint, things like fighting a pandemic, that's really important. And that's focalized our attention. Hopefully it can spin out into climate change and other things. That's one. But the other is, of course, that we have a change of management. We're going to get a new director general soon enough. And that is always a moment to provide a briefing book, to have a fresh look at the ideas. As all management eventually gets stuck into some kind of route or another, that's one. And we didn't know this when we finished the book, but we're going to have a new American administration. And there's no doubt that at least over the last year or so, a great deal of the challenge to multilateralism has emanated from one member state and the reactions that their actions have provoked in the rest of the world. So this sort of decline in the happy mood music that was always behind multilateralism. Everybody was for it. It was just difficult and we didn't get around to it now. But the mood music changed and it was actually actively anti-multilateral. Fortunately, the WTO didn't suffer the bluntest blows on that, like the WTO did in Paris Accord and things like that. But it was definitely hindering some of the movement. So I think anything related to a kind of reviving things, I like very much Alan's word of restarting deliberations, using it as a forum for discussion of important issues. One of the most valid forums in the sense that almost every country in the world is representative and in principle has an equal vote. So this isn't the World Bank, it isn't the IMF, and that's one of the reasons it's hard to do it, but it gives it a unique validity, a unique credibility that this is a place where global things can be discussed. And we have a whole group of ambassadors in the area which actually can conduct some of these negotiations. So that's, I mean, I went a lot further beyond your question, but I had a few things to say which I didn't slip in before, and I hope you don't mind. Thank you.
Not at all. It's actually a good launching pad for my last question before I turn to the audience. I might throw this one to Alan. As Pamela said, we are hopefully getting a new DG sooner rather than later. And I think that the WTO Director General is a position that in the general public is often misunderstood. Perceptions range from she will get to decide where ships go through to having absolutely no idea what she does, through to she personally decides appellate body disputes. But in actuality, I think that there's possibly no one on earth, apart from former DGs themselves, knows the office better than you. What are some of the tools in a member-driven organization that the DG will have at her disposal? What can the DG usefully do? What are the kind of options that she has to kind of build on some of these things you were talking about earlier in terms of convening, in terms of communication?
I think the new DG and the candidates, pretty much the 8 original candidates, have all said about the same thing with respect to bringing the members together. It's 164 sovereigns, and they're very jealous of their sovereignty. But they have, as was said in the introduction to the book and in the introduction to this session, a common problem, or more than one common problem. There's COVID-19, there's the economic recovery, which is global in nature, and there's climate change and problems of pollution, stewardship of the planet. These are common problems. I think also common problems exist with respect to women in participating in world trade. Common problems exist with youth unemployment, and the fact that, at least in the US, the Pew polls show that the young are very much more favorable to openness of trade than, let's say, white males over age 55, who have gone through a process of change that's been very hard, largely due to technological shifts, but also due to development of the rising powers, economic powers in the East. So what else can she do? She can make sure that the members know what the facts are. The book talks about this to a great extent, of factual analysis of what is actually taking place. Global Trade Alert is very useful in this regard with respect to subsidies, for example. But the committees, the WTO conducts its work largely in committees. The committees have to know more about what's taking place in the world of standards. We don't know very well, we know what's notified, we know what's brought up as specific trade concerns. We do not know what's not brought to us to a great extent. So there's darkness out there, the sort of the dark side of the moon, which now the Chinese have landed on it. So maybe they could help us illuminate a little bit of this too. It's factual information, and it's meeting with different groups to understand their interests and then decide where the commonality lies. We have not had much of that. In the interest of transparency and inclusiveness, we've actually had less going on than should take place. And one can be transparent and inclusive, which, for example, the joint statement initiatives are, and still meet with various members, say, all right, the least developed, what do you need? The recent acceded countries, what's your point of view? The small and vulnerable economies. So you have, for example, in an upcoming webinar in about 2 weeks, Fiji and China joining together on plastics pollution. They are different sized economies, if you look closely enough, but they have a common problem. So there's a lot of commonality out there that has not yet the members have not joined to understand them, to understand the issues as common issues. And I think the COVID-19 provides, and the pandemic provides an opportunity to go beyond this particular issue. By the way, on global value chains, I'd just say that the trade data shows that global value chains perform magnificently. The trade is up dramatically in the products that were in short supply because the stockpiling, which was one way to handle it, was inadequate. Investment was inadequate. Trade was essential to come to the rescue of even major developed economies. So I'd say there's hope, and the crisis has given a major tool for the new Director General to move forward on more than just this issue, but this issue is central. I don't think we have credibility if we do not come to grips with the problems of medical supplies. The vaccine is the next one up, and also aiding to the extent we can in the recovery, which is we have our limits. The IMF and the World Bank will be far more effective with their financial power, perhaps, than we will, but we can help. And the book, I would say, which I plan to hype internally here and with members, is a very good start.
Thank you very much, Arm. It's remarkable and heartwarming that in late 2020, a WTO DDG can talk about hope. After all that's happened in the last year, it's a really positive sign. I'm going to turn to questions from the audience now, and I'm going to be arbitrary and capricious in how I throw these around and beg our panelists to be brief in the interest of time. I might start with you, Emily, and a question we got from Azita that I think you kind of teased out a little bit in your earlier answer. So Azita asks that, okay, this book is full of pragmatic suggestions for WTO, and that's great, but don't we also need to kind of reflect on this fundamental paradigm shift, saying on whether liberalization fundamentally is good and whether it has delivered, especially for sustainability and inclusive development? And Emily, the reason I throw this to you is you were talking about how the role of private firms and value chains and sort of the different perceptions of that.
Yeah, but answering this question briefly will be a challenge. So this is a huge question, and it's a tension that I focus on in a lot of my academic work, is thinking about, on the one hand, the reality of global trade means that firms, and particularly large firms with a lot of market power across borders, have an important role to play, and governments can't pretend that that's not there. They need to listen to those firms to get the best information about how to construct good policy. On the other hand, and I'll just out myself as being unabashedly progressive in a lot of ways, the WTO needs to recognize that it can be and must be a force for forging a new future path in the 21st century. And that means the WTO needs to talk about not just reactively, but proactively. Alan already talked about the importance of thinking about carbon taxes at the border and addressing climate change. It needs to be able to respond to the many crises that are going to come because of climate change. And it, maybe most importantly, it has to create a structure and a new narrative for talking about how Alan's fairness, this idea of firms and workers and entrepreneurs getting a fair shake in global markets, how does that connect to a world where we value human prosperity, broadly defined, writ large? So this means not thinking back to sort of simple tropes of 20th century, trade is good, markets are good, that's all we need to say here, but instead focusing on the value of rules for forging an evolving cooperative system. Governments can cooperate or they cannot cooperate. So I'd rather live in a world where governments cooperate and set up standards and norms for how we talk to each other, so we don't do nasty things, so that all folks everywhere get a fair shake. And I think the WTO, by reforming its rule book, creates that mandate so that we get buy-in by everybody, I hope.
Another more hope and optimism. We're going to get banned as a trade Zoom. They're going to disconnect us. We've got a question. I think I'll throw to Simon, if you don't mind, Simon. It comes from Maria Sokolova. Simon, when you during your Geneva Trade Week panel for us, you spoke. You did kind of overview of what other sectors are doing on monitoring and how they manage that. And Maria's question sort of speaks to that as well, where she talked about, okay, if the WTO is going to go further and deeper and into some of these cross-cutting human issues that, for example, Emily raises, there's a risk that you're going to have trade law and trade specialists starting to weigh in on questions, as in the way they're already doing, of health, of biodiversity, in a kind of actionable way. How does the WTO, what do you advise the WTO, how does it navigate that? How does it avoid those politically sensitive issues while still doing what it needs to do? What's the advice there, especially from some of these cross-cutting, rather similar sectors that you worked with? You're muted, Simon.
I know I'm muted. I fell into the mute trap as well. I apologize. I think the answer to this question is really for us to focus on what part of any policy problem makes it a trade or cross-border problem. And that is when there's largely, my first starting point is always when there are negative spillovers. I do something and it hurts Richard's interests. And I think the interest of in the trading system should be about encouraging the development of rules or norms or ways to cooperate, which encourage governments to look across the wide range of alternatives available to them and to choose policy interventions which do the least harm, but are still effective at attaining different objectives. So no one has a problem with governments actively intervening in public health crises. No one has a problem with governments taking measures to do with biodiversity, but it's when they start doing that in a way which hurts the either intentionally or unintentionally that of the interests of their trading partners, that's when we get concerned. And I think we need to look in all of these different other areas that where there's cross-border dimensions. We essentially have to instill this sort of logic that it's the spillover that matters, not the state act per se that is the problem. And we need to be able to encourage the choice of state acts which create the least spillovers. And I think that's a key. If you want a very tangible example of this, when it came in the earlier part of this year, why was it that Canada, Mexico, and Australia did not ban the export of their manufacturers in the areas of medical equipment and goods, whereas other countries did? So how is it that the pandemic, which hit those countries, those three countries, somehow their governments didn't reflexively put in place export curbs? So why was that? What other alternative steps did they take to secure the public health of their populations? And we need to encourage governments to think in terms of looking at a wide range of alternative policies which have the least cross-border harm.
Thank you, Simon. We're coming up on 6 o'clock. With the panelists' permission, what I'd like to do is kind of very briefly summarize now, which is to say, encourage everyone to go and read the free ebook. It's been linked in the chat by CTI Graduate Institute, as well as it's on the invitation, and it is fantastic. And as you heard, comes with the recommendation of the WTO DDG, as well as the two co-editors whose support we were frankly counting on. Already. And then if you don't mind, I might just take one or two, these last two questions, just because there have been so many, only if the panelists don't mind sticking around for 5 more minutes. Is that okay with Simon, Emily, Alan? All right, Richard has just frantically messaged me that he is having technical issues and cannot reconnect, which I think speaks to the need for an e-commerce plurilateral as quickly as possible. But Alan, I might throw this question to you, and it's a bit of a difficult one for a DDG, but it's the end of the evening. So Ria Roy asks, WTO is fundamentally a member-driven organization. When it comes to updating the rulebook, almost any progress is going to involve some sacrifice of actionable sovereignty, of active sovereignty by members, if they create new rules. Fundamentally, that's what sort of rules are, a sacrifice of sovereignty. Given kind of the climate around, at least in some members, around nationalistic fervor and sort of autonomy, how can the WTO and WTO membership navigate and make a positive case for this kind of thing in this climate? That's an easy question for the end.
Well, it strikes me that this is a group of trade negotiators here, or at least they should be trade negotiators when they're doing their jobs well. And often they'll expect reciprocity. So it might be very good for them to lower their tariffs unilaterally, but generally speaking, they don't. They did on COVID-19 products, to a very relevant products to a very large extent, by the way. They didn't expect any reciprocity. They just said, why in the world do we want to tax, as was said earlier, imports of soap or other things that were necessary, personal protective equipment. So some things are done because they're the right thing to do. Some things are done because you're paid to do them. Subsidies are not going to be unilateral disarmament. It's going to be a tough negotiation, and it'll be based on reciprocity of those that really count. It won't be every country. It won't be the least developed who are doing the subsidizing. It'll be the most developed who are doing most of the subsidizing, and that'll be on the basis of reciprocity. We've had a dearth of positive investment by the members, a net positive investment. One example I give, because I chair a Cotton Development Assistance Committee here, is that the form of investment by the cotton producing countries of West Africa, who are extremely poor, $2,000 per capita GDP a year, is to not make speeches about policy space. They have lots of policy space. They can't grow cotton very well. They need help. They can't get benefits of cotton byproducts. So everybody, every member, without exception, that chips in both money and technical assistance to help these countries for the common good. There has to be more positive investment by all. and it's been insufficient on the part of the largest countries, to be sure. And what we've seen is the medium-sized developed countries and some of the larger developed countries have stepped up to fill the void because the largest have not been doing it and shown leadership. So that's another element of hope, namely that they value this system. These Canadians, the Swiss, the Norwegians, the Australians, New Zealanders, a whole variety of others, they value, and Nigeria, Costa Rica, a number of others, value the system, and they're investing by bringing intellectual capital here and their efforts, their energies. And that's a big positive.
Thank you, Alan. So I think that's as comprehensive an answer to that question as you're likely to hear. We might finish it up with a question for Emily, because I think given the last week, it would be a little bit crazy to have an entire panel without discussing the change in US administration. So I guess this is a question that sort of starts with TJ Miles in the chat, but I'd like to expand on a little bit, which is if what is your read on the incoming administration? If they reach out and say they want to help fix the WTO, would you believe that to be sort of a genuine overture? And where are their limits and pain points going to be when it comes to a re-engagement with the multilateral system, if indeed they have appetite for one?
Well, that's an easy question. Thanks, Dmitry. Boy, if the administration were to reach out to me, I'd just be very, very excited and optimistic, because I think there is incredible scope for the role of the United. And Alan just talked about it. Without saying the United States, big players need to do more in engagement with the WTO, with the multilateral system writ large. We can and should do more and play a more active role. And I think this administration would certainly do that. I think the inherent skepticism of the outgoing administration will not be reflected going forward. It's my diplomatic way of saying that. I think there will be a great appetite for the idea of multilateralism. And I think in many things like addressing the US-China frictions over the role of the state in the market economy in particular, and many other issues as well, but particularly the difference of approach, that's not changing. That friction, that tension will remain there. But I think the way a Biden administration will approach it is with trade partners. And some of that will be through the WTO, and other pieces of that will be multilateral cooperation, potentially outside of the WTO, but with longstanding economic and political allies. So I think there's a lot of force there. But you're right, there are definitely pain points. One of the biggest questions that comes to my mind, Biden has been making very strong promises and assurances on government procurement, right? Promising to buy more American in direct contradiction, I would think, to the government procurement policies that are in place and agreed on with our trading partners. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there and how that difficult balance is negotiated. I think another really, really important question for the US unilaterally is how quickly some of the trade actions, like the Section 301 tariffs against China or the Section 232 tariffs against many trading partners on steel and aluminum, how quickly those are rolled back. I think that will tell us a lot about where things go in the future. But there's no question that the relationship between the US and the WTO will be stronger because of last week's election.
Thank you so much, Emily. I think that's a fantastic place to wrap this up. I want to thank all of our panelists today, Emily Blanchard, DG Alan Wolff, Simon Evenett, and Richard Baldwin, who is frantically beating his router with a shoe right now to try to rejoin us. Thank you so much. I would encourage thank you to all of the participants. I apologize to those of you whose questions I didn't get to. It was entirely the fault of my moderation and not a lack of insightful questioning on your part. I encourage everyone to check out the ebook. It is fantastic. And I think the ideas in it are really important. And it's not the last, this isn't the last you'll be hearing of them. I hope they inform action at the WTO and thinking among the member states. And I just want to say this has been a momentous week. We've got a change in the US administration, the first glimmers of hope on a vaccine, the launch of this ebook, and the first optimistic trade panel in the last 15 years. So it's been a momentous week, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Dmitry Grozoubinski from the Geneva Trade Platform, and this has been a CTEI and University of St. Gallen ebook launch. Thank you so much.